Okay, so we're going live. Just let me start all of our social media stuff so that you guys can watch us not only on YouTube but also on Facebook. Hi, guys. Let us know if you can see us and hear us because it seems like we are broadcasting right now. Hello, guys. Welcome to the last one for today. Our last speaker, Gabriel Juriewicz, is with us, as you can see on the screen. So please join us, sit comfortably and listen to his presentation. Just let me remind you all that we will have a Q&A session after Gabriel is finished with his presentation. So if you have any questions during his speech, be sure to leave them in the comments section. I will be presenting them all during the Q&A session. Okay, so Gabriel, great to have you here on S4 Summit 2022. I'm leaving you right now with our viewers and I will see you soon. Hello.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope all of you can see my screen. My name is Gabriel Juriewicz, and I work for EPAM as a solution architect and manager of our Salesforce practice in Latin America. And today I will be talking about Salesforce GraphQL API. Now, what is new in here? What is the subject, the main goal, or rather a pretext behind this presentation? Is the GraphQL endpoint exposed by Salesforce in the recent Salesforce release, in Winter 23 release. This is what's new. GraphQL API by itself has been around for a while now, and a lot of you already may have used it in the past. A lot of you are experienced using GraphQL API. But because of this event of Salesforce introducing GraphQL endpoint, a lot of people will first hear about it from the release notes, right? I actually asked around my coworkers, friends. Not everybody is familiar with GraphQL API. For example, my mom didn't know it. So in this presentation, we'll focus on a lot of basics, yeah? And this presentation will be very inclusive. If you have experience as sort of the recap of the knowledge that you may already have, yeah? This is our agenda for today. So yeah, first I will explain what exactly GraphQL is, where it came from. Then I will present some examples, some use cases in which GraphQL tends to be more efficient solution from traditional APIs. Eventually, we'll have a look at some GraphQL callouts to Salesforce endpoint and some other endpoints. And there will be, of course, time for Q&A. So without further ado, what is GraphQL? GraphQL stands for Graph Query Language, and in layman's terms, that's exactly what it is, a query and manipulation language for APIs. Now, if I would like to dumb it down, I would say from a point of view of Salesforce developer, it's sort of like a SOQL for APIs. Well, maybe not exactly SOQL because it allows for read and write operations. GraphQL by itself is not a new thing. Well, not exactly. You may have fallen a victim to a clickbait because in the initial subject of this presentation, I stated that GraphQL will replace REST API. And that's not entirely a lie. GraphQL was developed by Facebook in 2012 for their own internal use and released to wider audience by 2015. Since then, it was growing strong, sure, but at the same time, it did not, of course, fully replace REST. It's difficult to replace something that is a widely adopted standard. But also the reason for this is that many people simply don't know it. And you may ask yourself, why would I learn yet another API if REST is working just fine, right? Now, through the course of this presentation, I will show that there are use cases where GraphQL API proves to be more efficient solution. And that's, of course, the main point in here, efficiency. So REST being popular and great still comes with some issues. It's very versatile, sure, but it's very diverse in the way we interact with it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. You have to always spend time learning the specific function, investigate what it is that this endpoint wants from you, and what it returns in response. GraphQL, on the other hand, have been designed with a certain standardization in mind, with a few ideas behind it. And those are the ideas. Single endpoint for all your data read and write operations. So like with traditional APIs, you may have different endpoints for different data needs. With GraphQL, you have always a single endpoint. It could be called GraphQL, but it doesn't have to be, to which you make queries for all your data needs. Single callout for multiple read-write operations. Now, what it means that you can query different tables. You can make multiple queries in a single callout. Also, what you can do is in the single callout to include read and write operations, although it's not always advised, right? Now, another idea behind it is aggregation of data from different sources. Now, of course, you can do it with other APIs. You can aggregate, fetch data from different sources in REST. Not only it's quite easy with GraphQL, but also what GraphQL allows you to do as a backend developer is to stitch the data from the different sources together into one data model and expose it to consumers of API in form of a schema. That is like a data model schema that they can browse through. Now, that being said, how that can help us with our applications? How does it surpass REST? Generally, with REST endpoints, the response is predefined by the owner of API, right? Meaning, obviously, that API developer decides, hard codes, what sort of data, which fields will be returned to you in response. And you have to adapt. Now, this can lead to underfetching and overfetching. So let's consider this scenario. You have a REST endpoint with the user data, let's call it users, and you send a list of user IDs as a parameter. What you want to receive in return are user phone numbers, nothing more. Of course, usually you would want more information than this, but this is just a hypothetical scenario, so just bear with me. But that's not how this function was designed, right? You don't get to choose which data you receive in response. In the end, you end up receiving a huge payload with all the user data available at this endpoint. The callout takes longer to process, and the application is laggy in effect. In this scenario, everything that is not a phone number is a wasted data, okay? Now, you could have a REST endpoint that accepts query parameters, but you may not. It's not just given. And sure, there are standards like Open Data Protocol, but they are not that widely adopted. Actually, you may ask yourself how many times you worked with endpoints adopting OData and how many times you had to just consume whatever endpoint was feeding you. Another possible solution would be, let's say, the bigger granularity of endpoints. So you would have endpoints for your specific data needs, but this is just not realistic. Yeah, we don't have that. It would be a very ugly solution. And then, on the other hand, we have underfetching. This is happening when we don't get enough data per a single request. And to get all the data we need for our application, we have to do multiple requests. We have to do requests to different endpoints. So in this scenario, let's assume we have an application for shop consultants. And in one screen, we have to display information about the client. Let's call it user info endpoint. And this client's purchase history. Yeah? To get all this data, we have to make a call out to different endpoints. Now, how GraphQL can help us here? Applications that call GraphQL API are generally more efficient because you can reduce round trips to server by getting all the data you need in the single invocation. It's best explained on examples, so let's have a look at it. I have my Postman here. Just allow me to maximize it, okay. Now, I connected to my Salesforce developer org. I forked Salesforce developers workspace to my own workspace. And I have all these predefined callouts in here. At the bottom, as you can see, I have GraphQL examples. At the very bottom, there are some callouts created by me. As you can see, this is our endpoint. Yeah, the endpoint on my Salesforce organization is called GraphQL. The domain is, of course, my Salesforce developer org. And this is the query itself. Yes, it starts with the keyword query, which means that we'll be pulling information, that we are making the read operation. Yeah, if it was if you would like to update, insert the data, we would use the keyword called mutation. It's not available on Salesforce endpoint yet, but it's available on other endpoints using, other GraphQL endpoints. Now, then we have the name of our query. Below is a root called UI API. Now, to help manage the complexity around the different types and fields within GraphQL schema, the schema is divided at root into few top-level types. For now, in Salesforce endpoint, we have just this one. In future, will be more. But all our data in our Salesforce database is accessible under this endpoint. Actually, I'm authenticated as my Salesforce user. So the data I have access to is defined by all the permissions given to my user. Yeah, field level security, OWD, object access. Since I'm administrator, I basically have access to all the data in my organization. Okay, here is our query. So as you can see, we are pulling data from account table, and here is our filter. We are pulling all the records where name does not equal Gini point. Below, I defined the fields I want to pull from the database. So I'm pulling created data name. Now this, I think it looks pretty intuitive, maybe not as clean, not as elegant as SQL, SOQL queries. But when you receive the response, you can see that query actually mirrors the JSON response. Yeah. All right. Below that, we have yet another query. Notice this is query. This is call out to the same endpoint, GraphQL, on my Salesforce domain. This time, I'm pulling information from the contact table. Again, very simple filter where name does not equal team bar. But this time, I'm pulling just a phone number. Yeah. So this could solve our overfetching scenario I described before. We are pulling just the phone numbers of the users. Below that, okay, I have query that pulls contacts and related parent account information and orders it by account name in descending order. Yeah. This is possible, of course, because of the two things. First of all, well, in Salesforce data model, there's a relationship between contact and account. Yes, it's given, sure. But this relationship is exposed in form of the schema to us, the consumers of the API. And that's why I can pull the related fields, related records. Now, some may say this is not exactly anything new, right? After all, you can have a REST API accepting query as a parameter, or like I said before, OData, right? With the list of fields. Salesforce itself has a query endpoint where we can send a SOQL parameter as input parameter. Actually, I have something like this in here. Yeah, I already have the saved query. As you can see, this is REST endpoint called query, against which I can simply send a SOQL query and receive pretty much the same results. Yeah. What it returns me are the contact names and names of the related parent accounts. The goal behind GraphQL is also standardization of that process. So every time you use GraphQL, you know that it expects you to send a query, right? And you may be a developer who doesn't know necessarily SOQL, but if you have experience using GraphQL with other platforms, you can make queries to the Salesforce endpoint exactly the same way. Okay, furthermore, GraphQL goes a step forward allowing consumers of API to do multiple queries to different tables in one callout. Let's check this query. This is what I have in here, yes? I created 4 custom objects in my Salesforce developer sandbox. And to put it in the context, let's assume a scenario where, due to the legal differences between different countries and different data models caused by these differences, our hypothetical company holds the product provider information in 4 different tables, yes? Normally, probably we could have one table, different record types, but just bear with me. So I have a separate table for German product provider, English product provider, US, and Mexican. And what I'm doing here is a single callout to the single endpoint. Again, it's our GraphQL endpoint with separate queries to 4 different tables. Now, for the clarity of this example, I'm pulling the same fields and I apply no filters. But I could, the same way, pull different fields, apply different filters, doesn't matter, yeah? What is happening right now is that I execute this callout and I receive JSON with the data of all of these tables, yeah? English product provider, US product provider, etc. Now, so if we were using REST, then unless we had an endpoint designed for this specific need, we would probably need to do 4 callouts instead of 1 to get the same result. It wouldn't be necessarily much more time consuming, since well, it wouldn't be more time consuming as long as one REST invocation does not depend on the result of the other. But it's still more troublesome, right? To have 4 callouts instead of 1. If you would need to execute your REST callouts in order, one after another, then it would, of course, take more time. All right. Data aggregation. Just a second. Okay. Another idea behind GraphQL endpoints is the data aggregation. The idea that we can fetch data from different data sources into one data model, stitch it together in so-called schema, create relationship between otherwise unrelated object, and expose the schema to consumers of API. I don't want to get too technical, but just imagine the situation where we have our backend code that is pulling data from different resources, and then we have our schema. Our schema is strongly typed. We have to define the types of our fields. In this scenario, let's assume that this is the game developer, right? The developer information comes from different data source, and games of this game developer find our fields in here, we define our schema, and we create relationship. So we have our mandatory field called developer on the game object that holds the ID of the developer. Yeah. Having this as consumer of this API, I can pull the games along with the information of their developer. The same way I can pull the developer with all the games that this developer created. I have to expose something called root queries. So I have 4 root queries in here, yes? Queries developers and games will just pull from the endpoint all the developers and games available. Now this root queries, developer and game, will pull the specific records by ID, yeah? Let's have a look at it. Okay, what I have in here is a cool client called GraphQL. There's nothing wrong with endpoint. Advised when working with GraphQL to use clients dedicated to GraphQL. Yes, because these clients allow us very easily to browse the schema, to browse the explore the data model exposed to us. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm using the demo endpoint called Swappy, which stands for Star Wars API. It's publicly exposed, doesn't require any authentication. Yes, we are just using this for demo purposes. So as you can see, we can explore our schema there. Yeah, I can, for example, click on all the species, execute this callout, and receive the results, right? Now, for all I know, as a consumer of this API, the species and let's say people could come from different data sources. I don't know that. I don't have to care about this, right? I can just copy one of the IDs of the species. Let's say this one, and pull the specific species by ID. So let's do that. Now let's choose some of the fields. Let's say name of the species. And since the backend developer created the relationship and exposed this relationship in schema, I can pull the information of, let's say, people of that species. So here it is, person connection, yes? I'll select some fields. Let's say name, skin color, and whatever, gender. And awesome, I get my results, yes? Now, I could write this query manually, but with the use of the clients like GraphQL, I can do it declaratively. It's very cool because right now I can just copy this and put it in the body of my post callout in my application, right? I could also theoretically, I could do this via even URL parameters. So let's say, right, I hope that works. Right, and here it is, yes. Now, since this endpoint is made just for, it's open endpoint, it doesn't require any authentication. What is exposed to us in here are just read operations, right? I'll not get too technical about the mutations, but let's have a look at this client. It's Apollo GraphQL. In here, I connected to the endpoint that allows me to do operations on my GitHub environment. Yes, I authenticated my GitHub, I connected to my GitHub, and I can browse not only queries that are available to me in this schema documentation, but I can also browse the mutation and see what write operations I can perform with this endpoint. I can choose one, for example, add project card payload, open it in Explorer, and here it is. Yes, again, I can just execute against this endpoint, copy it to my application, whatever. So yeah, this would wrap it up. Of course, I didn't want to get too technical, since if you want to learn how to use GraphQL API, it's best to do it at your own pace. To recap the most important information about Salesforce endpoint itself, it was released in beta in summer 22 release. It's widely available since the latest winter 23 release. You can access it behind this endpoint, your Salesforce domain GraphQL. Now, you could see me doing some some get functions with the use of Swappy. Now, with the Salesforce GraphQL endpoint, at this moment, we can do just post callouts to my information. And at this moment, we can only do the read operations, so just the queries. Developers behind this GraphQL endpoint promise that by 2023, will be also able to do the write operations on this GraphQL endpoint. In the future, the GraphQL schema will be comprised of multiple API families, but at the present, we have access to UI API root, under which, like I mentioned, we have access to all our Salesforce data as long as we have access to this data through the authenticated user. Yeah. Now, before we move on to Q&A, I would like to invite you I would like to say a few words about the contest organized by our company, by EPAM. The contest is called Jar Full of Clouds and Ideas. The only thing you have to do is to scan this QR code, answer one simple question, and you may win a car. Of course not, but you can win a backpack of EPAM full of EPAM swag. So I'll give you a moment to scan the QR code. This was pretty quick, by the way. I should have been speaking slower. Okay, but it's time for the Q&A. Let's see if we have any questions.
Yes, we do, actually. So I will read them in the order of sending them. Okay, so this seems like the first one. Okay, sorry, no. This is the one. What is the main difference between GraphQL and REST?
Now, good question. Well, first of all, with REST, you have multiple endpoints. With GraphQL, you have generally one endpoint. Yes, with REST, you do, pretty much that. With REST, you never know what to expect, what kind of parameters it expects from you. With GraphQL, you always know that what you have to do is to just send the query in this type format, right? Also, with GraphQL, using the clients like GraphQL, you can browse the schema that is exposed to you. So not only you, from one endpoint, you can access all the data you need, but also you can explore all the data available to you behind this endpoint. I hope that answers your question. But generally, the point behind this is the efficiency and standardization that you don't have always with REST. Awesome. Next question, please.
Okay, another one. Hi, if you were to choose one biggest advantage of GraphQL compared to REST API, what would it be?
Well, that's a good one. Quite a philosophical question, yeah? I would say that the fact that we can explore the schema and use the client is very, very comfortable. Like I said, because you can build your queries with in the declarative way. So you don't have to write it. You don't have to deal with any typos, anything like this. You can see all the data that is exposed to you. And perhaps the fact that you can do multiple operations at the same time, yeah, in one callout. Good question. Next one.
Okay, and next one. So far, this will be, I think, the last one. If you guys have any questions, please send them. Now is the time before we finish our meeting. Okay, and this one, really enjoyed your presentation. My question: does GraphQL have its integrated development environment?
Well, we have clients, yes, like I showed GraphQL. We have Apollo GraphQL. There is more coming. Actually, there's a cool application right now that you can use in Salesforce. Let me see if I have it opened right here. So if you would like to do your first steps and you don't want to, configure, authenticate anything, what you can do is you can go to App Exchange and install GraphQL Playground on your organization, and that's it. It's very cool because although you cannot browse the schema in the same way you would do with GraphQL, you just don't have to connect anything, right? You don't have to authenticate, you don't have to connect to your Salesforce organization because you're already in it. That's why you can just type it, click run query, and get the results. Nice.
Okay, and it looks like this was the last one, actually, guys. If you don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you so much for joining us. I would say this was a very concentrated information, but very, very informative. So thank you so much for joining us during S4 Summit. We hope it's not our last meeting, that you will join us again for another S4 Summit edition.
Yeah, of course, and thank you very much for attending the presentation.
Thank you so much once again, guys. This is all from us for today. Please join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. We will be giving you a lot more information, a lot more inspiration during the second day of S4 Summit 2022. So thank you once again, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.